As it's now just on the hour, let's start. Thank you very much. And a very warm welcome to this Oxford Farming Conference Fringe event in partnership with the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. My name is Sarah Mukherjee and I'm co-chair of the Oxford Farming Conference this year. The Food, Farming and Countryside Commission is always very prescient in the subjects it chooses to cover. And the title of today's event, Can I Have Some More? What's on the Menu for 2030, could not be more germane. And indeed, it fits perfectly with the conference theme of Roots to Resilience. Farmers and those who support them find themselves at the start of 2022 with an ever greater level of multi-dimensional chess playing than farm planning normally provides. Climate change, population growth, changes in diet, obesity, well-being delivery, the rural economy, woodland creation and ecosystem services. Take your pick and place your bets for the future. So how can we ensure that farmers continue to benefit from a system that delivers for the UK nations in many ways across nature, climate, health and the economy? And what does that mean for farm diversity and viability in the next 8 years or so? That is a scary thought, isn't it? 2030 is only 8 years away and we're not all flying around in spaceships unless we're Amazon billionaires. So we have a really, truly world-class panel to discuss these issues. Tim Lang is Professor of Food Policy at City University of London's Centre for Food Policy and an internationally respected and cited expert in food, farming, health and social justice. Sue Pritchard is the Chief Executive of the Commission and is focused on leading the organisation in its mission to bring people together to find radical and practical ways to transform our food system and improve our climate, nature, health and economy. She lives with her family on their organic permaculture farm in Wales, where she spends the rest of the time in her, what I can only assume is a 190-hour week, because she works so hard on in so many areas and to such enormous impact. And Professor Tim Benton leads the Energy, Environment and Resources Programme at Chatham House. He's worked with UK governments, the EU and G20. He's been a global agenda steward of the World Economic Forum and is an author of the IPCC's special report on food, land and climate. So the point of Oxford Fringes is debate and discussion. And so please start popping your questions in the chat or put your hand up. I already see one already. That's amazing. Using the buttons. Otherwise, I can't see you. We'll start, however, with an amuse-bouche from all our speakers, a couple of minutes to set out their stall. So Tim Lang, may we start with you?
Well, can you hear me all right?
Perfectly, thank you.
Yeah, great. Hello, everyone. Lovely to see. I just scrolled through everyone on. It's lovely to see many people I know, and indeed ex-students. I was asked to address the other Tim. We're doing a Timocracy here. The other Tim is going to talk more about supply, and I'm going to talk more about the demand end. So my tuppennyworth in 2 minutes. I think the current situation doesn't need rehearsing very in detail. Essentially, we've got a mismatch between what is being produced and the outcomes. Consumption is distorted, the public health problems are immense, they're complicated, they're not just about the food, they're about society, they're about culture, they're about expectations, or I would always say they're about mass psychology, advertising, marketing, but things aren't good. We've got a complete distortion of human bodies in relation to ecology. And there's runaway consumerism. I'm a social scientist, so I would say that we've got an individualization of what is cultural, short-term gratification rules, alongside hardwired biological givens. We won't go into, newborn children love sweetness, but we've turned sweetness into everything. And even when we take sugar out, we put artificial sweeteners in. There's something gone wrong. I call it a distortion. The drivers which shape consumption are basically stacked against good public health and environmental outcomes. The Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, which I'm on the advisory group for, has done a great job yet again. This is an argument that's been going for 40 years. The support for good things is inadequate. The support for bad things is overwhelming. In public health, and I work a lot in public health, we always argue it's almost impossible not to do the wrong thing the way things are stacked. So I'm being hard and stark. What needs to be done about this? Well, we need something to break the logjam. I salute the National Food Strategy Part 2 report Henry Dimbleby did. I thought he got that. He got it well. And they got it well. And it was elegantly put. But there's lots that's not in the National Food Strategy. Let's talk about that right now. But that's not one of the problems. He acknowledges and it acknowledges it. The issue is, what is government going to do to restructure consumption so that farming, that's what our conference is, can do the right thing? And in one word, I asked myself, and I'll finish on this, what is the one thing that we want from British farming? It's horticulture, actually. I always say less agriculture, more horticulture. Now, in farming terms, that means more biodiverse farming on the field, in the field, not just at the edge in some sort of tokenness. But the restructuring of consumption sends very good signals to farming of what we want for farming for the public good. And then all this, I think, very loose and weak language of public goods determining things. Amazingly, the government has not made food part of public goods. I cannot get over the stupidity of that, actually. And we really must collectively, anyone interested in farming, and I'm an ex-farmer a long time ago, but always think positively about the role of farming. Farming has a great role for helping consumption become more sustainable, let's call it that, sustainable diets from sustainable food system. But at the moment, it's not getting the right signals. And I don't see the right signals coming at the moment from the Agriculture Act or indeed the Environment Act. Food is a gaping hole at consumption end. So the demand situation is tricky, basically, and we're not grasping it.
Tim, thanks very much indeed. I just, if I may, just pick up on that point about horticulture. There's an awful lot, and the National Food Strategy tangentially addressed this, about how we fit the food we need to the land that we have. Do you think that is possible, or with the current land that we have in productive agriculture, or do we need technological additions like vertical farming and that sort of thing to recreate that increased horticulture sector?
Look, vertical farming and things like that, let's deal with it. These are peripheral as a response to the problem you're raising, and I'm trying to raise, Sarah. They're basically software and loose investment looking for something to make money out of. It's not unimportant, don't get me wrong. I can see a real advantage of some bits of it, but is it going to answer the problems that we're talking about? The fundamental mismatch of ecology, the planet, and human diets and health and outcome and happiness and good lives without being damaged by ill health. Those things aren't what matters. We've got ample grade 1 land. There are fights going on across Britain at the moment, Sarah, and I'm sure people on this call know that only too well. I'm involved in a couple myself, of grade 1 land basically being covered over by PV on the one hand, or housing on another hand, when those have very good roles to play on top of buildings, on top of barns, not covering up grade 1 land. This is a complete stupidity that we're allowing to operate in the name of rationality. Is there enough land? Yes, the problems are not, and that's why I urge everyone who hasn't read the UK Food Security Report, which came out brilliantly timed on December the 22nd, good time to get lots of publicity, by the way, and that's well worth reading, because essentially it ducks this issue, and it shouldn't duck this issue. That's the politics of food right now, is what do we want to do with our land? What's the role of farming in it? And I say, and it's difficult, you can't do it on the Pennines. I was a Pennine farmer. You can't start growing horticulture up on the top of 1,000-foot moors, but for grade 1 land in prime thing, we're treating it with contempt just as an asset to put other things on. And that is something farming has got a great potential to win public support over, I think, and certainly get better alliance. The farming industry, wow, you, and I will now say you, are really in a difficult position. Michael Gove has led you into a corner with that Agriculture and Environment Acts and bills, and you're now locked in with almost no influence. You've got to build influence and support with the public, is my honest appreciation. And there's good history for that.
Tim, thanks so much. What are we to do with our land, and what are farmers to do with it? Sue, I think that's almost a perfect segue into setting out your stall.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, and And thank you for your comments by way of introduction. If we are having any impact, and if we are, as you so generously said, prescient in the topics that we're picking up, it's only due to the quality of the contributions that we are getting from our commissioners, from our partners, from grassroots farmers who are doing this stuff all the time, and folk like Tim who help us out so generously. And I do want to say I'm missing Oxford. It's one of the few times of the year that I get to hang out with hundreds of farmers who want to talk policy, but who will also happily natter to me about really practical stuff like herbal lays, do we or don't we, or new bedding from a barn, or routes to market, all of that lovely stuff that we can just get caught up in. And very often it's sometimes easier to concentrate on those really, really practical questions when there's so much change happening all around us, as Tim's already alluded to, and you did, Sarah, right at the start. And we end up sometimes focusing on what we can do right here, right now, rather than all those other huge issues that just feel so far away from us and feel out of control. But that's one of the reasons that I love Oxford. It's for the opportunity to take stock at this time of year and to hear what's exciting people, what's worrying people, but also what they're doing already with the conditions that they have available to them to start to make really, really practical progress. Just before Christmas, as we were publishing our annual report, Jane will probably drop it in the chat with that prompt, and I was reflecting on what we've been doing, and perhaps allowing myself the luxury of reflecting on progress. I'm one of those, like so many of us, who are always worrying about what the next thing we need to do is, and I don't very often give myself a chance to reflect on those things that are going in the direction that we want. And as Tim's just said, the National Food Strategy was published last year, and it contains some really serious, thoughtful analysis and some eminently doable recommendations for government to follow up. So it absolutely lived up to, exceeded the expectations, I think, that we had of it. And we are seeing ministerial speeches talking about regenerative farming in ways that would have been considered just too radical just a few years ago. Soil health is centre stage in the SFI proposals, and even at COP26, when food and farming were largely absent from the table, nonetheless, Europe and global South countries succeeded in getting agroecology into the text for COP27. So for my own mental health, but also, I suppose, to bring a kind of healthy realism into the conversation, there are places where we are making progress on really, really difficult issues, but let's not pretend there aren't huge, huge issues in front of us this year. Big questions about farming futures and what it will take to be a viable farm business in the UK in the context of changes to farm payments. Questions of land use. You're absolutely right, Sarah, in saying we are pretty obsessed about that at the moment. Land use decision making. Who gets to contribute to those sorts of decisions that Tim was highlighting earlier, when grade 1 land is coming out of farming into housing. And of course, if more land is given over to nature, where will our food come from? And how can we ensure that we make the best use of the food that we are producing? I mean, you probably all know this stat. It always does my head in, as the young folks say. Globally, if food waste was a country, it would be the third biggest GHG emitter of all countries, below China and the US. And then, of course, there are huge questions of affordability, food affordability and citizen choice. Those questions that we've already raised have huge implications for the price of food, the cost of food. And whilst we have more choice than ever on the supermarket shelves, give or take the odd Brexit supply chain disruptions, we still have in the UK, in the 6th biggest economy in the world, rising food insecurity, rising hunger, and rising diet-related ill health as a result of overweight and obesity. So these are huge, huge questions, and the questions that at FFCC we're going to be really focusing on this year. But I think one of the things that we like to be able to do at FFCC, as well as think about practical solutions, is also to challenge ourselves and our colleagues and our partners to really think about, consider some of the kind of taken for granted and underpinning assumptions that seem to be shaping these big policy changes that we're making, or changes that businesses are making. And one of those big underpinning assumptions is that in order to feed a growing population, we're going to have to produce more food and intensify production. Now, we think there are some big questions now to ask of that particular assumption. And we've commissioned Tim Benton and Chatham House to test that assertion on our behalf, which will sit alongside the other work that we're doing around route maps to agroecology, which Jim Scone in my team is leading for us now, thinking about in a more fair and sustainable future, what do those route maps, what do those pathways really look like for farmers in different landscapes, in different settings, in different business models, and different opportunities. So getting into the really granular questions, how can we make this work? So that's what we're going to be thinking about this year. And we'll be doing that in partnership with colleagues around the table. Probably a whole bunch of you in the room. I can't even see all the names anymore, but we are very much looking forward to the sorts of debates that we're going to be starting here and now.
So thank you so much. That's a really fantastic tour d'horizon of really what's in your inbox over the next year. And we'll open up. Thanks, Liz, for putting your hand up. And thanks, I think there's another hand up. We will come to questions in just a minute and start that debate. But I would really like to bring in now, if I may, the second half of the Timocracy, Tim Benton, for your thoughts in terms of how we're going to feed ourselves, how we're going to farm ourselves in the next 8 years. 8 years, 2030. I think that's perhaps the most depressing thing of the title.
Thank you, Sarah. So building on what Tim and Sue have already said, I think there are two broad visions for the future of agriculture, either globally or in the UK. One is broadly agroecologically based, less intensive farming, more mixed farmscapes, heterogeneity at farm and landscape scale. The other one is much more land sparing. We build a fence around nature and we produce more food from the agricultural land through sustainable intensification. The plausibility of these two visions is differentiated not by data, not by evidence, but by the assumptions made about the demand for food, as both Tim and Sue said. For the world to be fed, or for the UK to be fed agroecologically, requires radical changes in behaviour, changes in diets, waste reduction, etc., to lower demand. This would require changes to what we grow, how we grow it, and how much we grow. But if you instead you assume that demand needs to be met by any supply, and that today's consumption behaviour is difficult to change, then extensive farming systems won't produce the volumes necessary. Under these assumptions, we'd need to grow more of what we already grow, but just grow it more efficiently. And ultimately, which of these visions is more plausible hinges on views about the role of the market. Now, we know capitalism is inherently market expanding, and Jevons paradox illustrates that the more we supply, the more we find ways to use the supply through driving up demand. And today's food system exemplifies that. Every time we increment productivity, we reduce prices, and the market finds ways to produce products that incentivize us to consume or waste more. The ultimate of this is that it implies that with a productivity-led model, we will never be able to produce enough to satiate the potential market demand. The crux, therefore, is this. For sustainability, we have to recognise there is a cap to what can be sustainably supplied and fit demand within it. This means moving away from the view that we need to meet whatever demand can be created whilst minimising the environmental impact, which is our current framing. This requires different forms of regulation to ensure costs are not levied on the environment and people's health in the name of profit for agri-food. It is perfectly possible to imagine an agroecological world where we eat the right amount of diverse products, produce sustainably, eat nutritiously, and are happier and healthier. We can also imagine ways that such a system will promote more profitable farming through selling less but producing better. However, such a change requires different, not necessarily more, regulation to shape the market and ensure sustainable consumption, as Tim said. It also requires us to move away from a model that has economic growth based on promoting consumption growth at its core. This is clearly a political, not a scientific issue. Increasing productivity, increasing efficiency, increasing intensity is not a given. It is ultimately an outcome of a set of political and ideological choices, and we should stop hiding behind the fact that the alternative visions are ideological and really recognise that they are political and ideological and they're not evidence-based. The best form of farming from a sustainability perspective is agroecological. There's lots of evidence for that, and yet we've somehow got ourselves into the situation that we argue that intensification is the sustainable route ahead, and clearly that is not the case.
Tim, that's great. Thank you very much. I've just popped something in the chat to say we'll take questions in a minute. And Peter's quick off the mark. My goodness, your reflexes, Peter, that's amazing. But while we're just waiting for some other questions, because I know there were others who wanted to ask, if I could just take the chairman's privilege. You talk about very fluently about reframing the question that we're asking ourselves, but do you think that should extend to consumers as well? I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of your thoughts that we're framed by the food choices that are made by others for us. I mean, that it's almost as though there's a kind of equality in the lack of agency for both farmers and consumers. So how do we change that bit of the food supply chain as well?
If I can start off, and I'm sure the others will have a good view. Yes, I think we are all caught in a system that we have spent 60 or 70 years really designing, and none of us particularly has agency. And if you think about the way that markets work, politics licenses the rules of the market, people license the politics, and then the market players act within those rules to make the profit that they can, delivering the goods that they can. So it's not a matter of consumers set the agenda or politics set the agenda or a market sets the agenda. We all jointly set the agenda, but we have very little individual agency, which is why that food and the politics of food has to be much more important to get the political decisions shaping the market to drive, as Tim said earlier, the right consumption behavior that rewards the production of the right sorts of goods in the right sort of way, and get away from this notion that ultimately the future of agriculture is about producing ever more, ever more, ever more for a global market that's never going to say that's enough, because we will end up just eroding our natural capital, just in a slightly more efficient way each year, but we'll still be eroding our natural capital and undermining our sustainability. Over.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks so much, Tim. Peter, thank you for waiting so patiently. Peter Clark, if we could hear your question, please. Oh, here we go. Yeah, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yes, I was very interested in Tim Lang's statement about why the government wasn't going to make food into public goods.
Sorry.
It's something I've been banging on for years. And one of the problems I foresee is the fact that this government appears to be hell-bent on a number of situations, such as climate change. And in my opinion, it would appear that anything in its way of achieving that has got to go. And we've just seen that example of the water directive, where slurry and farm manure was very neatly put in one package. Consequently, farmers not being allowed to put it on, certainly not in the autumn. Now, we know farmyard manure for centuries has been the fertility of the ground. We've been told by scientists the fertility is going. How are we going to keep fertility in the ground? I'd like somebody's opinion on that, please.
Thank you. I think if I may come to Tim first and then Sue.
This Tim.
Sorry, yes, Tim.
Well,
Sorry.
Both Tims are relevant on this. I mean, let me be frank. You can have, I've been picking up the other Tim's very elegant analysis, which I share. That basically we've got to stop fetishizing or waving this magic wand, the market, and start getting a bit more real about what markets are. We've got to frame markets to deliver goods that we want from them, which is why, Peter, to come to your question, I was so genuinely shocked at the way in which the government for 5 years has systematically refused to make food a public good from British farming. And if you've read my book, Feeding Britain, I argue that if it doesn't do that, it's basically pointing to a future for British farming, which is less, more imports, which is why, and I put in the chat, Sarah, the link to the UK Food Security Report. It's really important that any farmer on this call reads that. It's very long, by the way, but read it before you go to sleep rather than to go to sleep. I would only add to the other Tim's comment about agroecology, which I agree the evidence is very strong for, which is about treating nature within the soil and upwards and the outputs as, in post-Darwinian terms, as ecologically very diverse, maximizing the diversity from within the soil to up. But that requires us to think about public health. Anyone who knows my work, my colleagues and I at our centre have argued for what we call ecological public health. Actually, the future, I think, has to be agroecology for ecological public health. And unless we do that, we just start saying, well, okay, all we want from farming is good soil. Actually, we want good food from good soil and biodiversity everywhere, but also down people's throats. And that's a more complicated, it's a social reconstruction that's needed at the same time. And again, to get back to Peter's question, and to try to answer one aspect of it, because it was a huge issue you raised, Peter, as I'm sure you know. We're in a strange situation now where, although there are bits within the sustainable farm initiatives and bits of the public goods language for England, remember, this is only England, but actually the look at the long term, and the key driver for the government is just to cut subsidies. Subsidies are being cut by about 50% over the next 10, 15 years. Well, actually, 7 years. Look at the Australia-UK trade deal, it's 15 years. Food standards at the end of that, they've gone. All the promises that have been made about maintaining high standards, sticking to European levels and ratcheting up and using Brexit to get things even better than that stupid EU does, they've gone. You can import hormone, pesticide-riddled food from Australia. No difficulties, tariff-free. So there's some hard politics, Peter, coming into the reality of Britain. And we can't blame anyone else for this. This is us. We can't blame the European Union for this. We can actually start now getting a bit more real. And I think farming, and this Oxford Farming Conference and the other one, the Oxford Real Farming Conference, there's a very interesting overlap. This is me, the policy analyst here. There's an overlap emerging of the two agendas. This conference used to be associated with big farming, complacent, doing very well, big landowners. Now everyone's worried. The other farming conference was all about the radical upstarts and saying, we've got to do things differently. The good thing is there's much more cross-fertilization going on because we recognize that the food system is now at a really important point of choice. And I'm very anxious. Why I accepted the invitation to come on this, which I was very delighted to get, was because I think we've got a historic moment where farmers and farming can reconnect with society. We're getting a lot of discussion about reconnecting to ecology and environment, but not about society. When you just look at what I summarized in my book, Feeding Britain, it's a catastrophe out there. the diet-related ill health, a catastrophe. We've turned food into a cause of death as opposed to prolonging life. We've caused food to be a cause of food poverty. Food banks have boomed in COVID and Brexit. And look at the UK Food Security Report, and it's utterly complacent about that. Now, these are big choices that farming can't hide away from, in my view. It's a good question.
Thanks, Tim. Sue.
Do you mind if I mean, time is racing, and
Yeah.
I think the quick answer to Peter Clark's question is livestock in rotation builds fertility in soil, and he'll know, just as well as me how that works. I'm really interested in Tom Clark's question.
I was just about
in the chat.
To raise that. Yeah.
Do you mind if I ask that? Tom and I have lively discussions in Twitter and chat bars, and I wouldn't like today to be any different. I mean, I'm not going to comment on the lack of diversity of opinion on the panel, but I think I am going to pick up that question on this idea that behaviour change is needed, and I think the challenge that he makes quite rightly. Are we seriously saying that it would all be fine if we could just choose different populations to feed? But that is not the case. It is not the case that people want a food system that is environmentally destructive, ecologically destructive, economically unfair to farmers and growers, as well as people all around the world, and that is doing them harm. We've done a big chunk of work last year. My colleague Courtney Scott conducted a lovely piece of work last year with Big Local and Local Trust. So 150 of the poorest communities across the UK, talking to them about what food really means to them and what aspirations they have for food, particularly in the context of COVID, and thinking more about what food means to them and the place of food in their communities and their lives. And believe it or not, they want exactly the same things that we hear talked about in all sorts of other settings. They want healthy food, they want affordable food, they want quality food, they want food that is produced in a way that is sustainable for people and for planet. And they are very often outraged to be used as, if you like, marketing devices to drive cheap food policy. The problem is, very often, is that they trust that governments are sorting stuff out behind the scenes and making sure that what they have on their shelves is produced sustainably, fairly, equitably, and so on. There's so much of the global food system that is invisible to us as citizens. And then, of course, we're being asked to shift the global food system by the choices that we make on a busy Friday evening when we're racing around the supermarket trying to work out what we're going to feed everybody over the weekend. That is not how that's going to work. What we have found is that citizens do care about these issues, but they need more practical and straightforward ways of expressing those choices. And then I think the other big assumption that kind of underpins what Tom is saying there too is that somehow it's consumer demand that's driving global agribusinesses to put, bubblegum flavored cereals on our shelves, or some other hideous thing that's got more nutrition in the packet than it's got in the food stuff. That is also not the case. It's production that drives demand, and it's marketing departments in producing organisation that's driving demand in the economic framework we have around food at the moment. And that's the kind of thing that we have to start pushing back on and challenging.
Thanks very much, Sue. I'm going to jump around on the questions in the chat a little bit because, Tim, I wanted to ask, talking about diversity of thought, Gordon says, you could say that farming has never had it so good. Since Brexit, land values have never been higher, wheat and beef and lamb the same. Have you any thoughts on that? Is that a temporary good, or sorry, Tim Benton?
I thought you were directing that at Tim Lang, actually.
I've got another one for Tim.
No. I mean, I think all of these things are kind of good questions, and I'd also like to pick up on the last one because they all come down to what is it that's really driving the market, and who is shaping the market, and is it fair for the market to be shaped by the levers that are currently shaping it, as opposed to being shaped by notions of public good, in a sense. So if you look at our food system as a whole, as Tim Lang would say, it's now the #1 cause of ill health and mortality on a global basis. And one of the reasons that we've had such high COVID mortality in the UK is that we've got higher rates of obesity associated with our cheaper food than elsewhere in Europe. And that gives us a greater sensitivity to other viral infections like COVID and so on. So the lack of food, the lack of good food, is instrumental in undermining public health. And we know that the way that food is produced is instrumental in undermining planetary health. Now, we have designed that food system as it is by putting in place the priority subsidies, liberalizing trade, with the view that more food is a better thing than less food. Now, we've got to the point where we push that as far as we possibly can, and the more food is just creating more demand, more waste, more ill health, more environmental impact. So how do we change the shape of the food system to make it more life-enhancing, more nutritional, and better at providing environmental goods? That's not a matter of consumer behavior. That's not a matter of telling people what to eat. It's a matter of enabling people to access the right sorts of food in the right ways at the right sorts of prices. At the moment, the world grows 1/3 of the fruit and vegetables it should grow if everybody was to eat a healthy diet. So if we want people to be healthy, we should be finding ways to encourage more production of horticultural goods, less production of the calorific, high density sugar, palm oil, etc., grains, and so on. And we have chosen to make the system in the way that we have chosen to make it. Now, because the market rewards that, we think, well, you know, it's economic growth, isn't it? Let's make as much money as possible for individual actors and for the economy as a whole. But ultimately, when you add up all of the costs, it's no longer making any sense other than for a restricted view of what is good from a GDP perspective. But even then, if you build in the costs from a health perspective and the cost from an environmental perspective to the cost of the agricultural economy, it's a negative sum. And it's about how do we change the system over the next 10 years so that everybody benefits in a way that is good for us as individuals, for livelihoods of farmers, and for the planet as a whole, to reduce the anxiety, the biodiversity loss, the climate, etc., that is going to impinge on all of us into the future. So it's not, let's hope for a better future. It is an existential threat that we're facing over the next decades, and we have to find a way to get out of this from a human health perspective and from a climate and from a biodiversity perspective.
Brilliant. Thank you. No, thank you. We have 7 minutes left, and I want to squeeze in as many questions as I can. So Dustin mentions the FFCC's excellent report. He says, suggesting large reductions in some types of food, halving milk and chicken consumption, 2/3 less pork and excuse me, and eggs, and much less sugar. What can we do, he says, to make these reductions possible? Tim, I wonder if I could ask you that, and I will continue scrolling through the hundreds of messages we are now getting for some other quick fire questions. So if I may, and if I may ask you to be as brief as possible, please, yeah, no, Tim, whilst giving you an impossible question to answer.
I was going to say it is an impossible one. I mean, this goes to the heart about how do we have the transformation towards sustainable diets in a sentence. The short answer, Sarah, is with great difficulty. But we have to just hang on to two things. Firstly, that British diets have changed dramatically in 50 years. So we know that the British are prepared to change. Generationally, it changes. Marketing often does that and things, but also lifestyles, being a member of the European Union, people going abroad, eating, you know, Mediterranean food, etc., etc. Everything has changed. So we know the capacity of people to change their diets is great. Right now, we've got to line up two ducks, the production duck, agroecology, if you like, and the consumption duck, ecological public health. But that requires us to engage with consumers. And I think there is a fundamental problem that we, the British, and we British politics our politicians, are frightened of asking consumers to change. And yet we're living through COVID where people change remarkably quickly because they saw their self-interest in it. So there are some very serious politics with a big P and a little p. But that's not going to happen, Sarah, unless there is some engagement with citizens, with consumers. Say, it is in our joint interest to eat differently, to lower the carbon footprint, to lower the biodiversity damage, to reduce the embedded water in food. In other words, to enable farmers to start harmonizing with nature as opposed to helping destroy nature. That's not going to happen unless we engage with consumers. And everyone's frightened of that. And there are good political reasons why. Again, I discuss this in my Feeding Britain book, because politicians want to be re-elected and they're terrified of being accused of being nanny states and bossing people about. I think this conversation has got to get more grown up. Just talk parents and no one talks negatively about nannies. In my experience, it's usually people who've had nannies who start saying they don't want the nanny state. It's the rich who pioneer the anti-nanny state argument. Call it parents. No parent wants to see their child become a junkie, and yet that's what we've allowed to happen. It's a food junk culture has been normalized. I'm talking Daily Mirror language here. I can give a very posh academic version of it, but that's what it is. And we've got to unroll that. And we're not going to do that unless there's a we. If it's just left to Sarah Mukherjee or Tim Lang, me, I, making my choices, forget it. It's not going to happen. Unless we talk about society and the public goods, that's why I was so upset about public goods of food and health being left out of the Agriculture Act and the thinking of the government so far. And that's why it's very important, Sue would agree with this, the Food and Farming Countryside Commission, very important to back the Dimbleby National Food Structure to try to get something about society and not just putting the onus on individual choice, looking at a label. Come on, we've got to be a bit more grown up than that. So it's a big question you asked, Sarah. I'm sorry.
Yes. And then I think given
my short answer.
Given the time I gave you, I think that was a remarkably comprehensive answer. Look, we have 3 minutes left now. Not that I wish to be completely obsessed about this. So that's a minute each for one question. And this is something that we've talked around, but not actually to. Elliot says, thank you, by the way, for all your amazing questions and interventions. Wendy, I know that the FSCC Secretariat and team are going to be picking up with you about your question about East Anglia. Elliot says, how do we increase the quality of food whilst also allowing the very poorest to still afford it? Sue, can I start with you, and then we'll go to Tim Benton and then Tim Lang, and if you can be as brief as possible, please. Again, could you give me a 45-second answer for a 2.5 months question, please?
So I think that's an economic question, and it's a question that farmers and food producers should not be having to answer all on their own. And I think we've got some solutions in the chat already and expressed by colleagues. Let's talk about following the money. Now, sometimes we talk about following the money to look at who's getting all the rewards, and sometimes the follow the money catchphrase is used to point attention to big global agribusinesses who are benefiting enormously, profiting hugely from the food system as it is at the moment. But there's another way of following the money too. We can follow the money by asking Treasury to pay much more attention to the real material impacts of the food system that we have at the moment. We've talked about impact on environment, we've talked about impact on health and well-being, but we can also talk about impacts on rural communities and rural economies. So I think there is a very, very practical, very pragmatic way of inviting government to pay attention to these sorts of issues in the way that we have perhaps shied away from before. And just to make one final point, when people say, but citizens don't want to be told what to do, that is self-evidently not the case. If I drove at 70 miles an hour through your village in my Ferrari, I don't have a Ferrari, then you would be very, very keen for someone to come and tell me what to do straight away, as in, please don't kill my kids by going too fast. So there are some things that we're very content to be told not to do, because that's what makes us a civilized society. We agree to do things together because together we can all live healthier, more prosperous, fairer lives. So that's another, I think, taken for granted assumption that we have to challenge based on real, palpable evidence.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sue. Tim, Benton.
2 quick points. We produce a third of the fruit and vegetables we need. If we produce more of them, prices would go down and availability would increase. So that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that a marginal change in diabetes rate in the UK would save enough money that we could pay every farmer to be profitable and organic at the same time, and pay for the conversion costs and everything to change the system. So it's about the whole cost accounting, the whole system accounting, and it's about recognizing that we've paid farmers not to produce fruit and vegetables for 70 years, but to concentrate on major commodity crops. We could switch that around and make diets cheaper and more available and more nutritious and more sustainable if we wanted to collectively.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks, Tim. Tim Lang.
Very quickly, I'll get back to the core of the question. I agree with what Sue and the other Tim said. Food poverty is a real scar in Britain at the moment, and growing. And the rise of food banks in the COVID, and it's going to accelerate with energy costs going up now, by the way. And read the UK Food Security Report on this. I mean, it literally made my hair stand on end, the complacency about this when in that section. Let's see what you think. The answer to food poverty is to give the poor more money. It's quite simple, actually. And that's what we don't want to do. Except there is pressure, and it's been very good pressure, and I salute this government for carrying on what Labour started, the minimum wage stuff. Raising that is very important. So the issue of wages is a critical issue. And I'm someone, my academic work, have argued a lot about the need to have affordability of food to be a factor in the estimation of wages and the estimation of welfare benefits and things like that. So the lack of concentration on the cost of food and the affordability of a good diet, not a cheap diet, but a good diet. In other words, lots of fruit and vegetables, lots of the things that are good public goods is not there in public policy. Now, I'm a public policy professor, I would say that, but that's where public policy gets back to the other Tim and Sue's points. I think what this conversation is a reminder is we've got to reframe markets, not fetishize markets and say there's something that works in some mysterious way. It's us who make markets. And so for me, a good sustainable diet has to be one of the goals of a good market system. A good market economy is one that delivers sustainable diets affordably for everyone, not just rich professors.
Bless you. Thank you so much. Thanks very much indeed to all our speakers. Thanks for an amazing engagement in the chat. Please do keep engaging with the Commission on Twitter and with the emails and all the information that Jane and the team have been putting in the chat. We're way over time, so thank you very much. And I'm with you, Leslie. I could have listened to this conversation all afternoon. Unfortunately, time is against us, but thanks very much indeed for joining us, and keep that conversation going. Thank you. Thanks to the speakers, and thanks to you all. Bye-bye.